Hey everybody, thanks for joining us to another episode of Think Your Way to an Epic Life. And today I'm bringing an adventurer to the table. He's a doctor, he's been in the Marines, he's got all kinds of really neat stories to tell us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Samuel.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm glad you're glad. So let's start kind of at the beginning. You're in Albuquerque now. Where were you born and raised?
I grew up in South Louisiana, in the Cajun part of the state.
Oh, fun.
Yeah.
Okay. So you were born and raised there for how long?
Until I was 18.
Okay, 18. And then what happened?
When I was 18, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. I was an infantry assaultman, so I carried around a rocket launcher, shoulder-fired rocket launcher.
Wow.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, yeah, that's like every boy's dream, right? I'm gonna be a soldier I've got this thing, and yeah, wow. There's so much to dive into here. First off, why the Marines?
Well, I kind of looked at I think globally why I decided to go in the service is I was just kind of a wild kid and didn't think that I was in a good place to go to college and be successful. I had a ton of energy and didn't really have the kind of focus to kind of direct that energy into something positive. So that's why I was interested in military service. And then the different branches kind of offer different things, but the Marine Corps is a pretty strict environment. It's pretty Spartan, and that certainly had some appeal.
Wow. I'm trying to get into an 18-year-old wild kid's head. What gave you the pause to not just do what you wanted and do what you needed?
Well, because I just kind of felt like if I jumped right into college, it would have just been a glorious failure at that stage of my life. I felt like I had the capacity, the potential to be successful. I just didn't have the skill set. And I wanted to do something that wasn't college, but was also still a step forward. And military service, there's always like kind of extreme views in our society everywhere. Some people have really negative things to say about it, but by and large, it's something that kind of put me in a better position than I was in without it. So it's still, on job applications, on college applications, it's something that stands out in a positive way.
Absolutely. You experienced it. You went from this wild child, free love, let's just do whatever I want to do, to a Marine. What were some of the basic habits that changed?
Well, at first, the Marine Corps infantry is full of a lot of wild children. So it was, I was around a lot of other people that were like myself. One thing I didn't realize until much later in life is that I'm pretty severely ADD. And apparently, a lot of people with ADD gravitate towards the military because they function really well in a highly structured environment. So the Marine Corps will teach you everything. There's a correct way to lace up your boots. Anything from the bottom all the way up to, complex esoteric military stuff. Just every basic life skill, there's a proper Marine Corps way to do it. And I really benefited from having that kind of structure. I still struggle with an absence of structure, even as an adult. Having specific algorithms for kind of everything you need to do was a huge relief for me in some ways.
Oh, I bet. And how many of those habits that you learned then are you still implementing in your life today?
Oh, I mean, it was a kind of foundational change. The work ethic is the big thing that I still carry with me.
Mm-hmm. And that's why job applications, as somebody who's been in business for a lot of years, if it's military, or if somebody grew up on a ranch, a farm or a ranch, and they understand value of work, hard work, and boring, habitual things that nobody wants to do.
And it really stood out whenever I was in college, because just doing basic things like just showing up to class every day and just doing assignments on time every time, that by itself kind of put me ahead of a lot of my colleagues in ways that I didn't expect.
That's a really good insight. That really is, because people who don't have a work ethic they're surprised that you have one, and people who have one are surprised that they don't. Mm-hmm. So, wow. Okay, very fascinating. So you're in the military, you're young. Where do you start? Can you walk us through what was boot camp like?
Boot camp was pretty challenging. It, just a very different environment. Enlisting in the Marine Corps was the first thing I ever did on my own. It was the first thing I did as an adult, was to sign that contract. My family at home, they were not happy with that decision. My friends thought I was crazy. I enlisted in 2000. I walked into the recruiter's office on the day that we invaded Iraq in 2003. So I went to boot camp in October of 2003. So at that point, we'd been in Afghanistan for a year and a half. We had just invaded Iraq. So it was very, very serious.
Right.
Everyone was, people weren't playing around. So that was kind of, the general culture shock of, being told how to groom yourself and being specified what to wear, in addition to all the training and the history. So it was, I've said this in the past, and I know it can imply like a negative connotation, but it was a brainwashing program. But I think when I was in college, that was a brainwashing program too. I think the difference is you tell college kids that they're being brainwashed, and they do not respond well to being told that, whereas in the Marine Corps, they're just really overt about it.
Exactly. I mean, although I think most people would never submit themselves to the way you did, who would not be envious of the habits that you walked out of there with?
Yep.
Who would not give thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars? I will pay you if you give me your habits. It doesn't work that way, though.
Nope. I got paid for it, though.
Yes, that's pretty cool. Okay, so tell me about the actual. You get past the boot camp, and one thing about the boot camp, it couldn't have been a normal boot camp. It couldn't have been the average boot camp, because we were at war.
Yeah, so I think standards changed being at war for the last 20 years. It was probably different than what people experienced 5-10 years prior. It is probably different than what people experienced 5 and 10 years later. I don't know, because I only went through it once.
Right.
So I don't know what it was like before or after.
But when you walked out of boot camp, you were a different man.
I think so. Yeah, mm-hmm. I think my family thought so as well. After boot camp at Parris Island, I went to the School of Infantry at Camp Geiger in North Carolina. And then after my training as an infantry assaultman, I went to my my unit, which was at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina as well.
Okay.
About a month after I got there, and hitting the fleet is very different from being in boot camp and being in the School of Infantry. Those are formal schools where there's a lot of oversight. You're under the microscope from the federal government, Congress. It's very, very rigid, very specified. You don't recognize that as a recruit. You're just in the midst of all this chaos and people are yelling at you and you're just running all the time. But it was really apparent once I got to my unit, and that's where the training was in some ways much more intensive, but much less structured, because my first line leader was like 20 years old. So you have all these like really tough infantry Marines who are, their survivability is directly correlated to your competence and your proficiency at your job. And my senior Marines had done the invasion of Iraq. So it was sort of like the first crop of guys that came back. I was dropped into that. So it was in some ways much more brutal actually getting to the fleet, getting to the unit.
Yeah.
And then about a month after I got there, we deployed to Iraq. So that was like June or July of 2004. And I was, the Marine Corps was in the northwest part of the country in Al Anbar province. And we were operating up and down the Euphrates River, various towns, a lot of time at the Haditha Dam. And then in October of 2004, we were tasked for the big push in Fallujah. So we kind of broke down our area where we'd been staying, and we all moved down to Fallujah for the big pending battle that was coming up over there.
Gosh, so you were front lines literally to history.
Yeah, and that was, going back to my motivation for joining the Marine Corps. When I did one semester of college before I enlisted, and I studied history. I've always been interested in history. That's what I ended up ultimately going back, getting my degree in. And when you study history, it's kind of impossible to not kind of project yourself out there and like, oh, what would I have done at that time? What would my life have looked like? So that was definitely a contributing factor, because I knew that what was going on was going to have global and historic significance, and to have an opportunity to participate in that was pretty cool.
Thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I guarantee you from my listeners' hearts, thank you for what you've done, and what you're still doing. You're a great American.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so you're there, you're in Iraq. I don't know how deep you want to go. What was that like for you?
So it was very different. Most of the time I was there, we were doing just kind of standard counterinsurgency stuff. It was low intensity conflict. We saw very little kind of enemy action the first 4 months or so. Once we went down to Fallujah, it was a really different environment. It was, I remember where we were kind of housed in Camp Fallujah was right next to an artillery battery, and artillery was just shooting off day and night. And it took me a couple of days before I realized that I couldn't see the sun. We were dropping so many bombs, and it was kicking up so much dust. It would still get daylight and everything like that, but you just couldn't see the sun. And it was, after 3 or 4 days, it it took me a while to realize the sun wasn't there anymore.
Gosh.
And then we went into the city, and it was there was a lot of fighting. I wasn't there that long because pretty early on I got shot a couple times while my unit was crossing a street. We had one platoon on the ground in sort of like a blocking position, one platoon on a rooftop, giving sort of like overwatch. And I was on the platoon that was crossing this street. It was a big 6-lane highway with a median. And there were, I think 7 of us got shot crossing that street to get to our objective, which was on the other side. It was a cultural center.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so you're walking across the street with your platoon. You get shot.
We were running.
Oh, you were not walking.
No, we were not walking. It was a big kind of firefight engagement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're running. Wow. Holy cow! You're running into it.
Yep.
Whew.
Yeah. So didn't quite run fast enough. Got caught in the leg, and then I started crawling, and then they shot me in the arm, so I couldn't crawl anymore. So a friend of mine came and drug me out of there.
Oh my God! And you're still very, very close to this day.
Yeah, we're still pretty close.
Yeah.
He's a really good guy.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can't even begin to imagine the camaraderie that you have with someone who did that.
Yep. Yeah. It's sort of a life experience that I haven't been able to match anywhere else. Yeah. So adrenaline junkie would be appropriate? At that time, definitely. Yeah,
okay.
For sure. But really, at the time, if you take me where I am in my life right now and put me back in that exact same situation at that moment, I'd probably behave very differently. But there's this constant buildup, and that's the purpose of the infantry, is to go out and fight. So I enlisted in the infantry. I had about a year in the Marine Corps before that point. It was like a year and a month. So there was no shortage of kind of mental preparation and then physical preparation as well. And then you're also surrounded by people who are in the same boat, kind of have the same sort of like focus and direction.
Wow. Okay, I'm actually staring at you, aren't I? I'm just like, wow. I mean, like the mentality that would allow you to do this for this country and for my freedom is like, wow, thank you, so much. And we have to have people like you. I'm sorry that we have to have people like you. I wish it was peace and love everywhere, but that's not reality.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality, but it is reality. I think kind of pretending that it isn't doesn't do anybody any good.
Right. Okay. So you get shot. What how's your care? What happens? What?
So it was we had a really interesting battalion medical officer who subsequently wrote a book about it. His name is Commander Richard Jadek, and he wrote this book called On Call in Hell. And he basically kind of pioneered this idea that was in conflict with Navy doctrine. All the medical care in the Marine Corps is provided by the Navy. So Navy doctrine kind of stipulated that all of the battalion medical officers, there were 5 battalions that went into the city, stipulated that the medical officers remain outside of it and that we would bring our casualties out. He thought that that was a bad idea, so he just elected to go in. And within about 15 minutes of getting shot, I was being cared for by a physician in the back of an armored truck. Wow. And he was subsequently awarded a medal for valor, and he's the only physician out of Iraq and Afghanistan to get a medal with that's specified that it's for valor in combat. Because I think they attributed the lives of 50 Marines to him personally by electing to go forward into the city. So I get shot in the street, they pull me off within 10 or 15 minutes, the track's there. I wasn't the only casualty, there were several others. We all get loaded up and brought back outside of the city to kind of the first stabilization area, the Bravo surgical unit, and from there I got on a helicopter and flew to a hospital in Baghdad.
Gosh, okay. I feel like I'm watching a movie here. This is unbelievable. So you're in Baghdad. How long were you there?
I don't really know. It was a day or two.
Okay.
From in the city to outside Bravo Surgical at Camp Fallujah to Baghdad. From there, I went to, I'm forgetting the name. Might have been to Crist. It was some place they called Mortaritaville because they were just dropping mortars all the time, which is pretty horrible. Yeah, and that was pretty creepy because it was sort of the first time that I'd been in country where I didn't have my body armor and I didn't have a weapon. And the entire time, from early on in boot camp, you always have a weapon. And the whole time we were in Iraq, you always have your body armor and your helmet. And so having been stripped of all this stuff, and when the mortars would start dropping, these nurses and medical personnel would go and they would just lay on top of us, which is crazy, right? Like, it's insane that people were willing to do that, like totally unrecognized. We're all like medicated and doped up and freaked out because we had just been shot or blown up, and you got these people like draping their bodies on top of you.
Wow.
Super impressive.
Wow.
And then from there, I went to Germany, had a couple of surgeries there, and then I was flown to the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, which has since been taken over by the Army. It's now Walter Reed.
Okay. My goodness, okay. Woo-hoo-hoo. Okay, so you're here, you land in America.
In the States.
How did it feel to be home in the USA?
Yeah, it was pretty good. But I was kind of in this precarious position where I wasn't physically healthy enough to go back to my unit. And the physicians who were taking care of me sat me down. They were like, look, we can go either way. You've got 2 years left in your enlistment. If you want to go back to the fleet, we're going to do, rehab and kind of get you back to where you need to be. I expect that's going to take about 1.5 years to get you to the point where you can go back into the infantry. Or we can, work on just getting you out. And I'd never planned on staying in the Marine Corps long term. I signed up for 4 years. I didn't anticipate doing any more than that. So kind of spending another 1.5 years in the hospital to only be in the fleet for 6 months, not enough time to do another deployment. I was like, all right, I'll just get out. That was a long process as well. It took about 1 year from the time I made it to the hospital in Maryland before I was finally separated. Mostly just because I was in this kind of like bureaucratic limbo.
So surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry that happened. It just never happens.
But while I was there in the hospital, we were visited by people all the time. One of the people I visited was James Wright, who at the time was president of Dartmouth College. He had been a former Marine. He is the only Marine that's ever been president of an Ivy League school. And he went around and, gave his business cards to people, just kind of met with people, asked them about their future. I hung on to that, and once I got out, just wrote him a letter one day and told him I wanted to go to Dartmouth. I didn't expect to ever hear back from him, but he ended up calling me and he was like, that's not how the process works. You can't just write the president to get in. But he said, go to school for 1 year. If you're doing well and you think you can handle it up here, then then we can see about transferring you. So I went to the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas for a year. Again, never expected to hear back from him. But he, after my first semester, he called me up, asked me how it was going. It had been going well academically. So after I was at St. Thomas for a year, I transferred up to Dartmouth.
Wow, that is so cool.
Yeah.
Was it kind of like putting your head in a vice grip?
How so?
Just the competition, the level of the other students. I mean, it's not. It's you don't just walk into Dartmouth.
You don't. Yeah, and I definitely was walking around with an inferiority complex for a while, thinking that like, well, I got in here even though I'm not really qualified. All these other kids, they're so much more talented than me. It's also the component of being in the Northeast, where there's still just a lot of open animosity towards people from the South. I think I was probably more aware of that because the Marine Corps kind of whitewashed my accent, so people couldn't really tell just by talking to me that I was from the South. But yeah, there's just kind of like just open, not hostility, but just sort of people just very openly like look down on the South and people from the South. So that was challenging. And then also thinking like I didn't really qualify to be there. And all of the kind of impact of having been through the war was all kind of just stewing around while I was in college.
Yeah, I didn't go there because I didn't want to cross any lines. But you were shot, for goodness sakes. How did you handle that? How did you get past that?
Well, when I was in Maryland, I was still employed by the Marine Corps, but I wasn't working. So a lot of us patients, we just drank a lot.
Yeah,
really kind of excessively and recklessly, because we were, individuals taken away from our units, we were taken away from the people that we were with. We'd all been through traumatic experience, and we didn't have anything to do, and we were still getting a paycheck. So it was kind of the celebrating, like, hey, I'm alive, for a little bit longer than it should have been. And in that regard, college was really good for me. Because at some point I was like, oh man, do I have a drinking problem? And I think what I really had was just a boredom problem. So once I was able to get back in school, it was pretty easy to, to not drink and study like that. That wasn't a challenging transition for me the way it might have been for some other people. But I don't think I had a full appreciation for the kind of tremendous impact that my military service had on me for about 5 or 6 years afterwards. I was really, really frustrated, pretty confused, because it was very difficult to reconcile how much I enjoyed my Marine Corps experience with how horrible it was. It was difficult to recognize or to reconcile how beneficial it was for me, and also how detrimental at the same time. And so that just made me really confused, because I didn't understand how something could be good and bad. I thought it had to be one or the other. And I couldn't go to one side and say it was completely good, because there was so much horrible stuff that happened. 21 of the Marines from my unit died, and 13 of them from my company. Company's only a little over 100 guys. So we had, I think something like 60% of our guys were wounded somehow. Some severe, some were able to go back to duty. So there was a ton of very, very bad stuff that happened. And the kind of like internal conflict, I can't say it's totally good because all this bad stuff's happened. I can't say it's totally bad because I really benefited from it a lot. I think it made me a better person. I think being exposed to awful things that happen in the world that we share and the society that we share is a good thing. The kind of, what are those birds that stick their head in the dirt? Emus? So they don't have to look around at anything?
I know what you're talking about, but I can't think of it either.
Yeah. Well, that kind of mentality of just kind of not looking at problems so that you don't have to acknowledge how significant they are, I think that's really socially detrimental. So it was, and then what I later figured out, like the kind of most challenging aspect was that I wasn't articulate enough to be able to even talk about my experiences in any meaningful way. So if you can imagine that level of frustration where you've had this like huge, dramatic life experience, but you can't communicate that to someone else. You just don't know how. The currency of our communication normally doesn't include like the appropriate language to figure that out. So it wasn't until after college, this is where it's going to start sounding a little ridiculous. I got a job on a sailboat. My roommate in college was a sailor, he worked on tall ships before college in a gap year, and he was always talking about going to sea, and that was super motivating. And I didn't really want to get a job after college because it was, like I said, dealing with all this kind of like frustration, and I was a really angry person at the time. So I got hired to work on a tall ship that was going to go around the world and as a deckhand. But I also applied for a scholarship at the same time to study in Scotland. It was going to be a 2 years master's program at St. Andrews, 1 year at St. Andrews, and the second year is at the University of Damascus in Syria. I was so confident I was going to get this scholarship that after I was hired onto this boat, I turned the job down, and then I didn't get the scholarship.
Oh.
But it worked out because in Hurricane Sandy, the boat sank.
Oh my gosh, you're kidding me.
No, the boat sank. The lady that hired me and the captain died. Yeah. And part of the reason why I wanted to go to sea was to kind of face my fear of the ocean, because I think the ocean's pretty scary, and I can't imagine anything more horrifying than being on a sinking ship in a hurricane at night.
No, that's pretty way up there on the
so
horrifying list. But you've seen a lot of horrifying, so.
So I missed out on that, and then I didn't get the scholarship. If I had, I would have been in Syria when the revolution kicked off. So I kind of
come on.
So dodge those 2 bullets for the other bullets I didn't dodge, I guess.
Whoa! Wow! What an exciting life. Okay, I can hardly even catch up now. All right. Now what happens? You didn't go on the ship.
Didn't go on the ship, didn't get the scholarship. So I bought a bicycle and I rode across the country.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, I went from Louisiana to California.
Very cool.
And I think that was probably the coolest thing I've ever done. And I kind of explicitly, I didn't bring a phone. I didn't bring, anything to listen to. It was just kind of brought a Kindle with a bunch of books. And I think that was the real transition point for me, where I kind of worked through my own experiences. And I realized that even though I didn't have the language to discuss like going to a war and coming back, well, it's not like this is a new thing. People have been doing this for a really long time. A lot of people who are way more articulate than me. So I started reading just a lot of books and kind of was able to develop my own language and come to an understanding about, an explanation for what happened that made sense to me. And it doesn't necessarily make sense to other people, but that was okay, because it might not make sense to other people if they don't have these experiences. So, but the important thing was being able to explain it to myself. And it was on that trip, these 3 months across the country, this is the first time I visited New Mexico, that I feel like a lot of the unnecessary baggage from that service kind of just washed away. And what was interesting is once I got to the point where I felt like I could accurately describe my experiences, I no longer kind of felt the need to talk about it.
Huh.
It was weird. I can't explain that, but it was real. It definitely happened.
That is very cool.
Yeah.
You should write a book.
I should.
Wow. Okay, now next.
So I rode my bicycle across the country, and then, like I was mentioning before, I have access to these space-safe flights. Mm-hmm. That's when I started catching planes over to East Asia. And I was backpacking for about 6 months. I ended up in Vietnam, and I ran into this group of expats. It was a bunch of old Marines who'd fought there, and they came back home, struggled a lot, and then in their later years, they moved back to Vietnam. So it was a really cool experience. I actually celebrated the Marine Corps birthday, which November 10th, 1775. It's a really big deal for Marines. When I was in the Marine Corps, I was in boot camp for my first one, so that wasn't really an enjoyable experience. For my second one, November 10th, I got shot on November 9th, so I missed out on that one too. This is the first time I ever actually celebrated the Marine Corps birthday. I was with a bunch of old Marines who fought in Vietnam in China Beach, where they used to go for in-country R&R. And it definitely felt like a kind of like culminating experience that like kind of looking at these guys, and they'd been where I'd been. They'd been in a much more horrific conflict than anything I'd experienced, and they were still able to come out and they're doing okay. So it felt like that was kind of the I don't know, the peak of that kind of part of my life. But I also found out that day that my old roommate from Camp Lejeune, Robert Kelly, who stayed in the Marine Corps, he was killed in combat in Afghanistan. That happened at the exact same time. So Rob was a really good dude. His father was well known. His father was a general officer and ended up becoming chief of staff of the White House during the Trump administration, General Kelly. But Rob and I had been very close. We went to Iraq together. We were roommates back in Camp Lejeune. So I was planning on continuing to travel just sort of indefinitely. I have a kind of meager disability pension from the Marine Corps, but it was more than enough to, keep me sustained in East Asia where everything's really cheap. But at that point I decided to call off my trip and flew back to the States so I could go to his funeral. And then took the first job I could find that sent me to Afghanistan. So that was doing social science work for the Department of Defense. Excuse me. And I was in a place called Spin Boldak, which is on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, in far, far southeast Kandahar province. Just trying to unpack that Afghan mess, which I got there Christmas Eve 2011, and I was there through most of 2012, which was just after the Obama era surge of troops in country. The surge that we did in Iraq was ultimately very successful. But the Afghan surge wasn't. So it was just kind of as they were starting to draw down from that. Just talking to Afghans, trying to figure out what they wanted what they thought of us, what they thought of the Taliban. And I enjoyed that job. I think I was good at it. But ultimately I could see the writing on the wall that this wasn't moving in any direction that was gonna be good. So I started considering other professions, and someone mentioned that there were avenues to get into medicine for non-traditional students. I was 27 at the time, and I didn't think that was even a possibility to go into medicine when you were older. Thought it was all these straight-laced kids that never screwed up and had a very linear path, because that's what I was exposed to growing up. But when I realized there were alternative routes, I went to the battalion aid station on base in Spinboldak, and what I didn't know is that the commander of the aid station was Commander Richard Jadek, who treated me after I got shot 8 years prior.
You are a trip. It's like coincidences follow you everywhere.
Yeah, it was crazy, because we were on Spinboldak was a tiny base. There probably wasn't more than 800 people on it, and it was the guy that took care of me after I'd been shot. I was like, "Hey, sir,
I'm still here.
What do you think about me going into medicine?" And he's like, "It's a great idea," and totally supported me the whole way and gave me a lot of advice, and kind of that's sort of was the push from kind of curiosity, exploring this possibility, to really just committing to it. But my undergraduate degree was in history and Arabic. I managed to go through all of college without doing a single math or science course.
Oh my goodness.
Which was I was really very proud of that until I needed to go into medicine, and I had to go back and take all those courses.
Oh, yeah.
I applied to the post-bac program specifically for people to transition into medicine. There was a program at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. So I went there, and that was every math and science course with all their labs kind of compressed into about 13 months. It was a pretty brutal and demanding program. But I was ultimately successful. Moved back home to Louisiana and applied to med schools, and ended up attending Tulane University School of Medicine in New Orleans.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And so now, doctor, how does that feel? I mean, was there here's your degree, you are now a doctor. Did it feel different?
Well, for me, I wanted to be a physician in the Navy. And so that was my whole goal. Initially, they said no, but I was like, all right, well, let me just continue on with this process. I'll eventually get them to, this isn't a real no. This is just I'm talking to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. So I kept kind of exploiting every person who gave me a business card. Everyone said, anything I can do to help you out. My whole life, reached out tapped every resource I had. And after about 3 straight years of them consistently saying no, I finally realized oh, they mean really no. Which changed things a lot, because if you're serving while you're in med school, the military pays for med school. If you're not, you're paying for that. And there's also implications for the specialties that you go into. And I kind of had this unilateral focus. There was one thing that I wanted to do. And after my 3rd of 4 years in med school, I realized that I couldn't do that. So it was kind of a scramble at the last minute, because the process of getting into a residency program is pretty long as well. So it was kind of really kind of dramatically adjusting life goals as I transitioned from med school to residency.
Wow. Okay. All right. So being an an ER doc, which now is ED,
ERED. Yeah.
Okay. Either way. So that was not your first intention.
I was open to that possibility, but one thing that was really appealing for me about going into the Navy is you can serve as a general medical officer. So you can practice medicine in the fleet before completing your residency training. So emergency medicine was on the radar, but I thought that I was going to have much more time to make this decision. I thought that it was going to be a decision that I made, in 3 or 4 years. When I had more exposure to medicine, I could, I potentially go into a different specialty. But that once that opportunity went away, then I kind of had to pick one.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, I hope and pray that I never have to see you in that capacity. But if I ever do, I hope it's you, because you are a great guy. Thank you for serving our country. Thank you for your trip. I could do this, I could podcast you for days on end. I've never had a better one. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great.